Good morning. I'm Greg Bertelsen, CEO of the Climate Leadership Council, and welcome to today's webinar. Got a great turnout with quite a few people on the line, including members of the press. And in just a few moments, we'll be joined by Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana. And a little later in the program, we'll sit down for a virtual conversation with Tony Will, who is the CEO and president of CF Industries. Today, the Climate Leadership Council is releasing our latest report titled The U.S. Carbon Advantage in Chemicals Manufacturing. For the past 2 years, the Council has been studying the carbon efficiency of the industrial sectors across the world, both in the United States and among our international competitors. And today, we are releasing the latest installment of that research examining the chemicals industry. So before we get started, I wanted to define a couple of terms that we'll be using a lot today. So the first is carbon efficiency. And when we say carbon efficiency, what we mean, or what we're talking about, is the amount of carbon emissions it takes to make a certain product or good. Most products, most things we use are manufactured by a number of different companies in parts of all over the world. And while the final good may end up being largely comparable, the amount of carbon emissions it took to make that good can often vary widely. And so goods that are made with fewer carbon emissions relative to their competitors, we'll refer to as a more carbon efficient good, or we'll refer to that company or that country as more carbon efficient. And then sort of inversely, goods that are made with more carbon emissions relative to their competitors, we'll refer to as more carbon intensive, or we'll refer to those companies or those countries that made those goods as more carbon intensive. So why are we so interested in this in the policy context? Well, first, industrial emissions globally are an enormous source of greenhouse gas emissions. 30% of total greenhouse gas emissions across the globe come from industrial sectors. Think of things like steel, aluminum, but also automobiles, and really all of the goods that we use every day. Those are manufactured in some way, shape, or form by the industrial sector. For many of these sectors, decarbonizing, reducing the carbon emissions associated with production is actually quite challenging. Heavy industry uses a lot of energy. It requires a lot of heat to undergo a number of the processes. And while in some cases technologies exist, they are quite expensive and perhaps not commercially viable. And in other instances, the technologies to decarbonize are not currently available. Additionally, these industrial sectors often operate in highly competitive markets, meaning that a small difference in the costs of things like energy or labor or regulatory costs or a host of other factors can make the difference in terms of which companies are supplying global demand. And as we've shown in our research previously, and as we're showing today, there's often a big gap in terms of the most carbon efficient manufacturers and those that are the most carbon intensive. And if we're going to decarbonize the global economy, and if we're going to decarbonize industrial sectors, we need industry to make big investments to start ratcheting down emissions. But to get there, to have this be effective, we need those who are making the investments to become more efficient to be the ones who are increasingly supplying global demand. And this is where public policy can play a role in expediting this transition, particularly within industrial sectors. As you'll hear more today, trade policy is an arena that we believe has been wholly untapped and has a tremendous amount of potential to do just that, to expedite the decarbonization of the global industrial sectors. And perhaps a more accurate way to describe this would be climate and trade policies. So again, this is a term that we'll use a lot today, the intersection of climate policy and trade policy. There are a number of different approaches that are right now being discussed in the public policy arena in the US and around the globe. And there have been a variety of proposals that are in various stages of development. You may be familiar with the Council's carbon dividends plan. This includes a border carbon adjustment with an accompanying domestic carbon free, which would assess a fee at the border based on the carbon intensity of goods coming into the country to sort of disincentivize high carbon intensive goods. But so too have there been proposals and explorations by both Republicans and Democrats around a BCA only policy, a border carbon adjustment only policy, as it's often referred to. And this would be essentially just the border adjustment portion of what I just described, a fee or some form of adjustment at the border to penalize higher carbon intensive goods and ensure that we are maintaining the competitiveness of U.S. companies, particularly those that have made those investments to lower their carbon emissions. The European Union is in the process of developing a version of this. They call it their Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM. There are sectoral agreements which are starting to be discussed with more seriousness. In fact, the Biden administration right now, or is in the process of negotiating a new trade arrangement with the EU for steel and aluminum for the first time ever to incorporate carbon intensity into a trade arrangement. This would be a way to, again, create a disincentive for that higher carbon intensive product that's coming into the US and the EU market. And I'll talk a little bit more about the steel industry in a moment. And then there's a concept which is gaining some traction, often referred to as a carbon club or a climate club. And this would essentially be a multilateral or a group of countries coming together, agreeing on common terms and establishing a bloc which would do a border carbon adjustment around that sort of combination of countries. So a lot of different options, which all in our view deserve deeper exploration. And that's part of what we do at the Council, is part of what we do at our new Center for Climate and Trade, with the overarching objective to encourage more production with firms that are doing it the most efficiently, disincentives or penalties for those who are the least efficient, the highest emitters, and ultimately incentives for everyone everywhere to compete on the basis of lowering their emissions. And given the magnitude of global trade, $28.5 trillion per year is traded internationally, and the scope of emissions that are traded across international borders, 25%, 1/4 of total global greenhouse gas emissions are embedded in goods that are traded internationally. There's a huge amount of emission reduction potential at this intersection of climate and trade policy. But there's also a huge economic incentive and opportunity for the U.S. to lead on climate and trade policy solutions. Let me explain why. So this may be a chart that some of you have seen before. It comes from a report we published in 2020 titled America's Carbon Advantage. And what we're showing is the U.S.'s relative carbon emissions performance in about 20 different aggregated sectors compared to a number of our major trading partners and competitors. And while this is a data-dense chart, the way to interpret it is any box that's above 1 and in red means that that country's process is more carbon intensive than the United States is. Or said differently, any box that's in red means the United States does it cleaner, does it better, with fewer carbon emissions. Now, this is a positive environmental story for the United States, for industry, but there's an opportunity here to leverage it. Through climate and trade policies, we can take this carbon advantage, and with the right incentives at our border, we can encourage more investment in production in the United States as part of a strategy for global decarbonization. More production, more investment, more manufacturing in the US as a way to decarbonize the globe and start that process. Let me give you an example from the US steel industry, how this would work. So here's another version of the chart that I just showed you. This one zooms in a little bit tighter on 2 different types of steel manufacturing products, longs and flats. And as you can see from this chart, the US once again does quite well against most of our competitors. Actually, in fact, in this chart, we're the most carbon efficient versus all of the steel that we import. So again, a positive environmental story for the industry. But we took this analysis a step further and ran a simulation with a climate and trade policy in place. In this case, we were modeling the council's plan, which of course includes the border carbon adjustment. And as you can see from this chart, the results are quite intriguing. So when we sort of reshuffle the supply stack to favor more efficient steel, what happens is high carbon intensive steel gets pushed out of our market and it's replaced in whole by more efficiently produced US manufactured steel. US profits go up, US sales go up, and again, the imports go down. And the imports that are displaced are upwards of 5 times as carbon intensive as the US manufactured product. So to summarize, by implementing a climate and trade policy in the steel industry, in this example, we're leveraging our carbon advantage to the benefit of US manufacturers and their workers, but as a result, are also lowering the emissions from the steel that we consume here in the US. This is a huge untapped opportunity for the US economy and the global climate, but that opportunity exists beyond and extends beyond just the steel industry. So let me now turn to the report that we're releasing today examining chemicals manufacturing. Now, the chemicals industry has a very important position in the global decarbonization discussion. On the one hand, it's part of the low carbon solution set, from insulation to lightweight materials in automobiles to hydrogen fuels, but it's also a major contributor of greenhouse gas emissions. It's the third largest industrial source of CO2 emissions globally. This is across all chemical manufacturers across the world, emitting more than 1 billion tons a year. In our analysis, we studied 5 bulk chemicals, and the reason we use these particular products is first because of their wide use. They're used in a number of different final products throughout the economy. My colleague Katrina will talk a little bit more about that, but they're also among the highest carbon producing within the chemicals industry. But the results of our analysis show a similar trend as we've seen with other industries, which is that there is a notable carbon advantage among the US chemicals manufacturing sector. The EU does well in this analysis also. And notably, which is another theme that we see in previous studies, China tends to be a higher carbon intensive emitter. They perform less well when viewing things on a carbon intensive basis. So again, it's encouraging to see the US among our leaders, or among the world leaders in operating in a carbon efficient manner. But we know this isn't the end game. What we need ultimately is to improve across the chemical sector, across the globe, and in all industries. And again, we believe the way to start expediting that process is through climate and trade policies, which in the near term would have the effect of driving immediate global emission reductions by seeing production shift from carbon intensive manufacturers and carbon intensive parts of the world to more carbon efficient chemical manufacturers and more carbon efficient parts of the world. Because of the advantage we have from a carbon intensity basis, we would see a boost in US manufacturing. And in the longer term, we would establish a system of incentives for everyone everywhere to be competing on the basis of lower carbon emissions. And that's really the ultimate goal. But to get there, we need thoughtful lawmakers to develop smart policies. And so I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by a US Senator who sits at the nexus of the topic we're discussing today, a senator representing a state with an enormous manufacturing presence, including in the chemicals industry, and a senator who has thought very deeply about energy and climate policy. Senator Cassidy, Bill Cassidy, grew up in Baton Rouge. He attended Louisiana State for both undergraduate and medical school. In 2008, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, representing Louisiana's 6th congressional district. Then in 2014, he was elected to the U.S. Senate and reelected most recently in 2020. In the Senate, he serves on several committees, including very relevant to the conversation we're having today, the Finance Committee and the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. And we are so delighted to have Senator Cassidy with us today. Senator, we're talking about the chemicals manufacturing sector, something I know you know a great deal about, and specifically their greater carbon efficiency relative to a number of our competitors and how we might leverage that to boost the U.S. economy, but also lower global emissions. Earlier this year, you published a framework titled Resetting American Energy and Climate Policy, in which you contemplate approaches to accomplish these very objectives. So I wonder if you might be willing just to kick us off by sharing some of your views about what's most important for resetting U.S. energy and climate policy.
Yeah, I think what's most important is to recognize that there is a nexus between emissions and GDP growth, as well as military strength. Now, I will put all those in there, and you may say, well, this is a climate conference. Why are we talking about national security or military strength? But a kind of first has to happen or nothing else does is to bring the American people along in a strategy which will help lower emissions. If the American people think all we're doing is offshoring carbon intensity to a country like China, making their economy stronger and ours weaker, the American people are going to say ex-nay. My state, if you will, is the crucible of this, with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs related to carbon-intensive industries, making products essential for modernity, and yet my state has lost more land mass to rising sea levels than any other state. So the strategy we have taken is a carbon border adjustment mechanism, whereby if there is a industry in which the product being produced is far more carbon intensive than that which is being produced in the United States, there would be a fee placed upon that product when it enters into the United States. Now, if you're a national security hawk, you like that, because inherently in this, you're going to penalize a country like China, which ignores environmental regulations in order to lower the cost of manufacturing, thereby incentivizing companies to move there with their jobs and their investment. If you're a climate hawk, you're going to like it, because in this, you're going to establish a paradigm in which worldwide the goal will be to lower emissions as opposed to tolerate their increase. And Greg, you were speaking to that as I was kind of listening. And if you were concerned about an economy, you're going to like it, because the U.S. has invested so much already in lowering emissions. And so if you want to establish your business in a place where you're less likely to have to pay fees, you're going to do it in the United States. In that way, we speak to multiple aspects of our American electorate, reassuring them there's something in it for them, and thereby creating an international paradigm in which emissions are lowered.
Oh, thank you for that. And we obviously very much agree with you. Let me zoom in on one part of your opening remarks, which is this concept of creating an international paradigm. One of the pillars of your plan for a longer term approach is aligning with our allies to do things like better understand supply chain emissions, work together to reduce emissions intensity, and sort of band together to limit the market access of abnormally high carbon intensive products from some of the countries that you just named. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about the importance of that type of cooperation with allies on this.
Yeah, so it's clearly we should have a buyer's club. And the EU has already put in a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and the UK, Canada, Australia, Japan, we can imagine others that would. And in that, you would recognize each other's efforts. That is, I'm told, a minority of the world's population, but 60% of their high value consumers. And so if you have this buyer's club where we have some sort of agreement as to the carbon intensity that would be not subject to a fee, but another level above which it would be subject to a fee, not only do we preferentially favor companies which have invested in these carbon lowering models, if you will, which are going to be companies which reside within these countries, but we also change the paradigm for a country like Vietnam. Currently, if Vietnam wants to better compete with China, it is going to totally ignore environmental regulations, because that's the way you lower your cost of production, and therefore you're going to be more likely, or at least as equally likely, to get investment from abroad as does China. If, however, you say that if your carbon intensity is above a certain level, you're going to pay a fee. And we know right now the Chinese are way producing above that level. If you're Vietnam, your strategy is going to be no longer to mimic China, but rather it's going to attempt to achieve that carbon reduction in the production of your product. That is the way that you'll have preferential access to a high value add set of markets. So we think it not only helps the workers within our countries, but we think it also changes the paradigms for supply chains, which are far flung.
Well, and that's really the key. It's ensuring that we're rewarding our companies and workers who are doing the right thing, who are decarbonizing, while creating that global incentive and competition for others to follow our lead. Let me come back to the concept of supply chains for a second. I know this is something that you've given a lot of thought to, specifically making our supply chains more resilient. At the same time, one of the concerns that we sometimes hear as we talk about these kinds of approaches is if we're penalizing countries like China for their high carbon intensity, are we going to be disrupting supply chains? Don't we rely on China for a lot of goods? Do you see those objectives sort of strengthening our supply chains, but also disincentivizing high carbon goods for places like China as in conflict? Or do you see ultimately those objectives as complementary?
Oh, it's totally complementary. By the way, you're not saying you cannot import a good from China. You're just saying if it's produced above a certain level of carbon intensity, there shall be a fee. Now, we already have tariffs upon goods coming from China. This could just replace those tariffs with one in which, reasonably speaking, the Chinese could lower if they seek to comply with international norms when it comes to climate issues. That's number one. Number two, I do think we've already seen the process of inshoring and nearshoring, reshoring and nearshoring various supply chains. So this process has already taken place, in large measure, I think, driven by all the issues in China, both the force majeure they impose on certain products during COVID, but also their repeated lockdowns and their zero COVID policy, which has made it difficult that is disrupted. So if you will, we're riding the wave. There's already a motivation, an incentive, and a momentum for companies to nearshore or to reshore. We would just kind of give a little bit of oomph to that, greater reward to that in order to continue the momentum.
So I want to ask one more question about the international scope of what we're talking about, and then I want to turn a little bit to domestic policy. But so this is something that you've obviously explored very deeply. We've watched with some interest some of your Democratic colleagues explore similar concepts, some of your Republican colleagues explore similar concepts. You've been at the center of, I would say, most of the major bipartisan legislative breakthroughs over the course of the last several years. Do you see an opportunity for bipartisanship on some form of a border carbon adjustment?
Absolutely. You've mentioned earlier that some of my Democratic colleagues have come up with the same model. We introduced our concept, and then Joe Manchin and Mitt Romney were so enthused about it, they spoke about it publicly. Subsequently, I think Joe has a version, but also Sheldon Whitehouse. Now, as you might guess, Sheldon, who's further to the left, and I, who am a conservative, may have different inflections upon it. But the fact that we are both have the same policy suggests that there is a substantial common ground. I'll also say that if you go back to what I said initially, that this is also a national security play. I was at a conference, the McCain conference, in which it's kind of national security writ large, and spoke to how this could have a positive impact upon national security. I had several of my Republican colleagues from the House and the Senate approach afterwards saying they would like to work with me on this. And so, again, if you write it large, it's not just climate, it's national security, it's economic development, it's Western hemispheric development, it's closer ties with our allies. Then you start broadening the coalition, and the CBAM gets at that, and it gets at from the left and from the right.
Stay there for a second. Your Republican colleague, Senator Kevin Cramer, drafted an op-ed or published an op-ed with H.R. McMaster last December, talking about how this kind of an approach would deleverage some of Russia's influence on the global stage because of their relatively high methane intensive natural gas. Obviously, a bit of a prescient op-ed, given that a few months later there, of course, was the invasion of the Ukraine. As we look at some of our other competitors and adversaries around the globe, there are similar dynamics. Obviously, China is sort of top of mind in the foreign policy context. They also are among the most carbon intensive. Is there a way that we can use this to sort of accomplish some of those geopolitical goals that perhaps we in the EU wish we had accomplished over the course of the last 5-10 years as a relates to
Absolutely. It will. Now, two things about that. First, it helps us geopolitically, as I've mentioned, and as Kevin and as H.R. McMaster mentioned, vis-a-vis China and Russia. Relatively speaking, weakens their economy, and therefore, if you will, deprives the investment they can make into their military or in other initiatives which seek to undermine Western influence and to impose their values, which frankly, I think are terrible values upon other countries. That's number one. But what it also does, if you take that more global view, it kind of dispels the, how to put this? Well, let me just phrase it differently. Oftentimes, I will see policies put in place in the United States, EU, elsewhere, in which the advocates pat themselves on the back because, oh my gosh, we've lowered our emissions. No, they've merely offshored those emissions to a country like Russia or to China with their environmental standards, and they're ignoring even the environmental standards they have. Consequently, global greenhouse gas emissions increase even though we've lowered. Indeed, global greenhouse gas emissions can demonstrably more increase than that which we have decreased. Now, I'm always frustrated by folks who ignore this. They are paradoxically working against the interest of the global climate when they are offshoring, when the policies they implement offshore these carbon-intensive products to a country like China or to Russia. I've recently read that 25% of the SOx and NOx, which is on the west coast of the United States, is actually produced in China, blows over the Pacific on the trade winds, and descends upon our country. Now, the more we do to worsen that, the worse off our west coast. And I can give example after example. So I like the idea that we are broadening our view to include the effects of the secondary effects of Russia and China, because not only does it help us as regards national security, it also helps us understand how we need to have effective strategy to lower global greenhouse emissions.
Thank you for that. And I'm being virtually tapped on the shoulder by my team, reminding me that we are opening the chat for questions from the audience. So please, if you're listening in, use the chat box to post your question, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Let's switch gears a little bit to a policy item that's sort of right in front of the Senate, and that's permitting reform. I know this is something that you've given a great deal of thought to over the course of many years. It was part of the suite of policies that you included in your framework earlier in this year. And just yesterday, you and I think 37 of your Republican colleagues proposed a permitting reform bill. Of course, we have all been watching with interest the Democrats negotiating some form of a permitting deal around the sort of Joe Manchin arrangement around the IRA. So I'm curious, again, coming back to sort of bipartisan compromise, seems like there's at least some overlap between what the Republicans have proposed and the Democrats, not perfect overlap. Do you think ultimately there's a compromise to be had here, and sort of within that, what's most important to be included?
I sure hope there is. I think actually there needs to be some sort of a shot clock, some sort of, if you've not permitted by X date, then it's going to happen, which seems a little draconian, but I think it's really the only way to get federal agencies off their rear ends and to get things done. if you're a low-level bureaucrat, you can make a mistake. My wife once said, never assume malevolence when it may be incompetence. I mentioned that once to my Senate colleagues. He smiled. He goes, well, never assume incompetence when it may be malevolence. And there can be just a little bit of something which triggers a re-review and another 18-month period by which that re-review must take place. And I'm thinking of an actual example of total incompetence of a federal agency, but they had to reopen rulemaking for another 18 months because of the agency's incompetence. Now, never underestimate the ability of a federal agency to slow something down. What's the practical importance? Right now, California just announced a goal: no new car can be sold there in 2035 unless it's electric. But at the same time, within the week, they said, please don't charge your car in the afternoon because our grid's going to go dark. Hydropower, because of droughts, is not able to produce sufficient amount of renewable energy for that place, for California. So does anybody think that we are going to have permits for sufficient generation of electricity by 2035 for the Californians to achieve their goal? Nobody. So if we don't get permitting right, it's going to thwart whatever we wish to do in order to capture emissions, to have better transmission, to come up with the renewables we need, but also to, in an environmentally sound way, use North Americans' traditional energy resources. Permitting is the linchpin. And right now, bureaucracies sometimes seem as if they wish to thwart permitting as opposed to enable.
Well, and too often the debate gets framed as sort of traditional fossil energy resources versus renewables. But as you point out, the challenges are facing both industries. And if we're going to succeed in decarbonizing, we need a heck of a lot of investment in energy infrastructure to get these resources to their demand centers. So we've got some questions rolling in a moment. I'm going to ask you a question about innovation, but I'm curious, you've been talking a lot about, you've been a leader on energy policy for a long time. You've been talking about climate. You talk about how your state is sort of the intersection of all of it, which it really is. I'm curious what kind of response you get back home when you sort of explain the nexus of these topics when you're talking about climate policy. How's the response back home been?
There's excitement. If you look at the bipartisan infrastructure bill, as well as previous authorizations and investments made in the previous administration, there are billions to enable hydrogen hubs, blue hydrogen hubs, where you would take natural gas, make hydrogen, but sequester the carbon or use it in another product line. Now, by the way, Air Products has made an announcement, like right now, of maybe 6 months ago, of $3 to $4 billion investment in Ascension Parish, taking advantage of Louisiana's ideal geography, both to sequester carbon, to bring natural gas onshore from our offshore platforms in order to make the hydrogen, and then to ship the hydrogen overseas to Europe, for example. So $3 to $4 billion already. Other companies have made a strategic investment that's going to be in Louisiana. So what we can do is take our core competency of oil and gas development, of petrochemical refining, and we can then adapt that to the new economy to use our geology and our geography in order to create a perfect ecosystem of producing lower carbon intensity products to ship them overseas. By the way, I'll mention to folks the concept of the CBAM, of which we help our industry, help our workers, but we also have a kind of geopolitical play as well. Folks back home like that. So in my state, there's been a real interest in this, both from the economics of it, as well as the geopolitical aspect of it.
Well, the question from the audience that you may have just answered, which was which technologies in the lower carbon space excite you the most? I heard you talk about hydrogen. I heard you talk about carbon capture and sequestration. What is it out there in the sort of innovative technology space that gives you optimism that we can decarbonize our economy, start to decarbonize some of these challenging sectors?
Yeah,
perhaps
so
you've already stated them.
So we just mentioned the blue hydrogen that is being made in Ascension Parish, but our governor has signed an agreement with Arkansas and Oklahoma to make both green hydrogen and blue hydrogen. Green hydrogen from the wind farms in Oklahoma, to use it to power the 18-wheelers coming out of Arkansas. Think J.B. Hunt and Walmart, but also potentially to power marine vessels on the Mississippi. Keep in mind, 3 of the 4 of the largest ports by tonnage in the United States are in South Louisiana. And so that is an incredible thing we can do. Secondly, direct air capture. Again, Louisiana's geology is perfect for carbon capture sequestration. So if you're a Dow or a Procter & Gamble or an Oxy who's made a commitment to net carbon neutrality by date certain, in my mind, you would preferentially expand in Louisiana because you can take your emissions, capture them, and sequester them directly beneath you. And there's going to be enough companies doing that you can combine together for the pipelines. And so the marginal contribution of each goes into the payment for the whole, and that will help sequester. I also think direct air capture, which I'm told works better in a warm, humid environment. And last time I checked, my state qualifies. That would allow, again, an existing pipeline for industry to have a marginal contribution from a direct air capture outfit. One more I'll mention, Dow is looking at, along with X Energy, looking at small modular nuclear. So we've got a petrochemical corridor in which you could have a small modular nuclear facility that could power multiple petrochemical refinery plants, offloading like right next door and 2 doors down, if you will, to refineries that are very carbon intensive, helping them to lower the carbon intensity of their product, therefore making them more competitive in a CBAM environment that we spoke of earlier. There is a lot in my state to benefit.
Makes a lot of sense to me. Well, let me ask you a question about what role domestic policy might play in sort of expediting some of that work, if there is one. We've talked a lot about CBAM, and I got one more question for you on that before we part ways. But before we get there, assuming we're successful in establishing some form of a border adjustment, we're driving more production and investment back to more efficient manufacturers in the U.S., more efficient manufacturers in Louisiana. Is there a role for domestic policy to layer on to sort of ensure that we keep making progress here at home?
Absolutely. Clearly, permitting reform is a big layer of domestic policy that has to be. And I would also say that some of what we've passed, again, in our previous bills, for example, the SCALE Act, an amendment that I authored with Chris Coons, in which there is assistance to help build the CO2 pipelines that will take the carbon dioxide from one place to another. I think that the more we produce our North American natural gas and oil is a huge domestic policy. First, it creates jobs for working Americans who maybe don't have a college degree, but in one of these industries can make $80,000, $100,000, $120,000, changing the trajectory of their lives, their children, and their grandchildren. So that's an important one, but also recognizing that domestic oil and gas production uses environmental standards far more stringent than produced elsewhere in the world. So since we know through 2050, through the International Energy Agency and others, that there's going to be rising demand for oil and gas, one, we can produce it here, creating our jobs, do it in an environmentally sound way, but also have the prospect under a CBAM regime, et cetera, of decarbonizing the life cycle of the use of that. So it's good for global greenhouse gas emissions. It's good for domestic employment for those working Americans who work in the mining and manufacturing industry. It's good for our national security.
So a policy that's good for national security, good for our domestic workers and industry, and lowers global emissions sure seems like something we should be able to get, all of your colleagues in the Senate on board. Should we be expecting legislation anytime soon? How do we where are we in this process of actually making policy, and what should be our watermark for success in terms of number of bipartisan co-sponsors upon introduction? To get ahead of myself,
we've already introduced, if you will, publicly our CBAM concept just to get people acquainted with it, and you have to socialize the idea. So it takes a little while to explain, but once you explain it, people say, "Oh, that's a pretty good idea." So we're kind of halfway in that process right now. The fact that, again, that there's folks on the left who introduced their own proposals since shows that common ground. So we are now speaking with them to see what that can be. It won't happen this Congress. I'd like to think it can happen, next Congress. But if it does, I think that this is something which can have an incredibly powerful impact and can be bipartisan. As regards the number of co-sponsors, of course, I would like to have at least 20 when you start, because that shows that in an evenly divided Congress, if you have 10 and 10, that you're able to get something through. That's, if you will, the paradigm that we use for the bipartisan infrastructure bill we spoke of earlier. So that would be the goal. Lastly, you'd want to have the administration on board. Again, bureaucrats can kill anything, which is not to say all bureaucrats are going to, but if you just have enough gumming up the works, then the best laid plans will be years in delay, if it ever happens. And so we have to have the administration engaged so that they can facilitate the execution of it, aside from providing support.
Have you had the chance to talk with anyone in the administration about it, or any feelings about how receptive they'd be to the concept?
Not formally, but you can see that the White House, when I went to Europe and spoke to some of those folks, John Kerry is speaking about getting a buyers club. I suspect John and I won't agree on very much, but we do agree on the concept that if we link with European allies, that we are going to have greater strength as we go forward. And then obviously, if you have a Sheldon Whitehouse who's introduced his own CBAM, you presume that he's been speaking as well on his version, if you will, with the administration. So I know that there's at least some intellectual seeds that have been dropped around there.
Very good. Sounds like we've got progress to make. So, Senator, we're very close to the end of our time. You've been so generous to spend a half hour with us this morning. I just want to give you the opportunity to share a few final remarks. And again, just thank you so much for your work and spending the morning with us.
Yeah, I think thanks for having me, Greg. This is a very important forum. I thank you for having me. And let me just say that people need to think about climate in a first, second, third, and even fourth degree aspect. If the policy we pursue, all it does is offshore our emissions to other countries, global greenhouse gas emissions demonstrably worsen. If what we do undermines support from a large swath of Americans, making some poor, there's going to be a public revolt against that. So if we can think first, second, third, and even fourth degree, we can come up with bipartisan policy which benefits our country, which benefits the world. That should be our goal. We should accept nothing less.
Well, Senator, thank you again. Thank you for your thoughtful approach, as always. We look forward to working with you and your office on these concepts. But again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Greg.
Next, I would like to introduce my colleague, Katrina Rourke. Katrina serves as the executive director of the Center for Climate and Trade at the Council. She has been recognized for her leadership on climate policy by Indian News, The Hill, National Journal, Grist, and her work has been published in national, local, and trade media. Katrina is also the author of the report that we've been discussing today. And so with that, it's my great pleasure to turn things over to my friend and colleague, Katrina Rourke. Katrina, over to you.
Thanks, Greg. The senator's a tough act to follow, but I'll do my best. As you've heard this morning, trade terms that value carbon efficiency can achieve a number of geopolitical goals, but they can also establish a new set of incentives for producers on a global basis to begin competing on the basis of environmental performance. This is precisely what we study at the Center for Climate and Trade. Opportunities to leverage trade policies toward better climate outcomes. And I'm really glad to walk you through our latest report and our findings this morning. As Greg mentioned earlier, we've studied the relative carbon intensity of economic activity, both on an economy-wide basis and for the steel industry in particular. And we continue at the center to search out data for other industries with particular characteristics. We want them to be economically significant, relatively carbon-intensive sectors that have a significant nexus to global trade. This is where we'll get the biggest bang for our buck, so to speak, on climate and trade policy. And what we have here today is a substantive step forward in understanding one such industry, the chemicals industry. This is the largest manufacturing sector in the United States, makes up the largest share of US exports, and is spread across 47 US states. So clearly, chemicals manufacturing is important to the US economy. But our industry is important to the global economy too. The US produces 13% of the global chemicals supply. That makes us the second largest chemical manufacturer in the world, behind China. Chemical products can also support decarbonization activities. You heard from Greg some examples, building insulation, plastics to lightweight materials, even coatings for solar panels that improve efficiency, hydrogen or ammonia even as tradable fuel alternatives to power the future. There are many other uses being deployed today and being developed for future applications. So this industry is vital to support decarbonization, but it is also today a significant source of emissions. The chemicals industry is the third largest source of direct industrial emissions globally. We hear a lot in climate, in trade, in deep decarbonization conversations on an international basis about industries like steel, cement, aluminum, but less about chemicals. Given the share of industrial emissions from this sector, it's clearly a critically relevant portion of the economy to address. Moreover, the chemicals industry is hugely important in global trade. Products of the chemicals industry are much more broadly traded than products from other industries. Consider that the global trade in chemicals, even by a pretty narrow measurement, is nearly 3 times larger than global trade in iron and steel and cement combined. So, given the vast amount of global trade in chemicals, this is an industry where climate-aligned trade policy may have unique and outsized value in rewarding lower carbon manufacturers and encouraging investments in efficiency and decarbonization. But the chemicals industry is really complex. In the US, manufacturers make over 70,000 discrete products, and that level of differentiation makes the industry difficult to study on the whole. In the paper that we're sharing with you today, we focused upstream on the earliest stages of production, being converted from raw materials, mostly fossil fuels, into what we call bulk chemicals. Less than a dozen bulk chemicals are necessary stepping stones for the vast majority of chemical products that we interact with on a regular basis. This also tends to be the most carbon-intensive step in the chemical manufacturing process. Much of the differentiation in carbon intensity across chemicals industries happens here at this step of producing bulk chemicals. We worked with Carbon Mines. They're a data provider and consultancy that has assembled a database for dozens of chemicals from thousands of companies, countries, and regions. And we have studied with them 5 bulk chemicals that are particularly significant to US chemicals manufacturing. Those include benzene and toluene, which are inputs to things like foams, solvents, tires, preservatives, you name it. Ammonia, which is itself a fertilizer, an input for other fertilizers and has other industrial applications. And polyethylene and polypropylene, the 2 most significant building blocks of plastics. Here, we summarize our findings for the 4 largest chemical manufacturing markets. Those markets are the US, China, as we've mentioned, the European Union, and Saudi Arabia. All have significant market share and significant positions in international trade. And I'll note that within these individual chemicals, the largest manufacturers can vary. If you review our report, you'll find a more detailed analysis chemical by chemical. For ease of comparison, just like the carbon advantage work that Greg showed you earlier, we've indexed US carbon intensity to 1 and allowed other countries to float against the US carbon intensity. Again, red boxes with figures greater than 1 indicate that manufacturing that chemical in that market is more carbon intensive than in the US. Blue boxes, figures less than 1, manufacturing that chemical in that market less carbon intensive than in the US. And the white boxes suggest that average production is about on a par with the US in carbon intensity. At a glance, the US is significantly more carbon efficient than most global competitors and the world average. Indeed, global manufacturers require 10 to 60% more emissions than the US to create the same products. Put differently, the US is 10 to 40% more carbon efficient than our global competitors. Against China, the differences are particularly stark. The US is twice as efficient in producing ammonia and nearly 3 times as efficient in producing polypropylene. This comes down to key differences in process choices, feedstocks, energy sources, and overall efficiency of the chemicals industry and the economy as a whole. China tends to use significant shares of coal both for energy production and as feedstocks to bulk chemicals manufacturing, and that drives up emissions intensity over US producers. We rely more heavily in the US on diverse lower carbon electricity supplies and have a preference for natural gas feedstocks. Notice also that the US and the EU have relatively similar emissions intensity profiles. These are the 2 most efficient major manufacturers across bulk chemicals. They do have some important differences. For instance, the European Union tends to use more petroleum than the US as a feedstock. In some cases, like for polyethylene, that tends to improve the carbon efficiency of the manufacturing process. In others, it increases carbon intensity versus the US. Saudi Arabia also tends to rely on petroleum feedstocks, though their emissions intensity figures are generally higher than Europe's. This may be due to electricity supplies, which are nearly twice as carbon intensive as Europe's, as well as artificially low domestic energy and feedstock prices, which just results in lower incentives for energy and process efficiency improvements in their domestic fleet. It's important to note that the data underlying this chart give us a major step forward in understanding, but they're by no means without limitation. The quality of the carbon mines data and carbon intensity analysis more broadly depends upon what manufacturers and governments publicly disclose or what can be inferred from publicly available sources. And so asymmetries are inevitable. Data quality and disclosures are higher in some jurisdictions like the US and the European Union than in others like China and Saudi Arabia. For example, asymmetries in reporting things like methane leaks from energy systems, capacity, trade figures, recent changes to energy and resource systems, all create unevenness in the data that we're using here. Other factors are just more difficult to capture, like ongoing maintenance and efficiency investments. For these reasons, we believe that the figures here are likely to be a floor on the US and European carbon advantage over other major competitors. The true figures may well show wider differences than we are able to report with available data. And a final note before we move on, these reflect country averages by chemical. Within countries, carbon intensities can vary considerably, and many firms beat out industry averages with uniquely carbon efficient manufacturing. This is a look at a weighted average for the industry as a whole. It doesn't describe the behavior of any individual firm. So why does the US have a carbon advantage? At the top of the hour, Greg showed our data that shows a US carbon advantage across economic sectors, and that's clearly echoed in the chemicals industry itself. Even within identical production pathways, creating entirely substitutable products, the US has a tremendous advantage over other major producers like China. And while the specific differences will vary by chemical, by manufacturing process, there are 3 important trends that set the US apart. The first is our access to lower carbon, lower cost materials. The US has reliable access to domestically produced natural gas and natural gas liquids, two key inputs to bulk chemicals manufacture. We also have a very large refining sector, which gives us an edge. Oil refining is itself a significant source of emissions, but some bulk chemicals, for example, the aromatics, benzene and toluene, are often byproducts of gasoline refining, which means in the United States, we produce these bulk chemicals alongside other products as a matter of course. We don't need to rely on other higher carbon manufacturing pathways. The second factor is that the US has access to low cost, lower carbon electricity. US electricity is more than 40% zero carbon today from sources like nuclear hydro, wind, solar, and natural gas is the largest fossil contributor to power supplies. That gives us a carbon efficiency edge over other major producers like China and Saudi Arabia, which depend on coal and petroleum disproportionately, of as much as 50%. And the third component is, to keep it simple, ongoing investments in efficiency and innovation. The US has invested heavily in process improvements, adopted technologies like cogeneration of heat and power, and doubled fuel and power efficiency. These investments are largely echoed by our partners in Europe, operating under competitive conditions with a sort of strong profit motive to improve efficiency across the fleet. So today, Europe and North America outpace China and the Middle East in industrial energy productivity by 2 to 3 times. To conclude, let's return to the bigger picture. The chemicals industry is a necessary component of global decarbonization, but also a major source of industrial emissions today. We need all the tools at our disposal to encourage the investments necessary to decarbonize this sector. Among those tools must be instruments that mobilize the power of international trade and market signals. Rewarding more efficient producers will tip the scales their way, provide a financial advantage to firms that decarbonize, and hold accountable those firms that drag their feet. Especially in the goods that we're talking about today, manufacturers are creating heavily traded, entirely substitutable products. There is no reason that higher emission pathways need to stay in service or should continue to edge out lower carbon competitors. This gives a unique opportunity to US policymakers to leverage our carbon advantage and create better economic outcomes for US firms and workers, better climate outcomes for ourselves and our global partners, and achieve other geopolitical aims like Senator Cassidy was laying out. Climate and trade policies can bend the curve on global emissions. I look forward to learning about these issues alongside of you. And for now, I'll turn it back to Greg for a conversation with Tony Will. He's the CEO of CF Industries, which just happens to be the world's largest manufacturer of ammonia, one of our subjects today. I thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Katrina, and appreciate your presentation. So I am now delighted to be welcomed by, or joined by, or delighted to welcome and be joined by the president and CEO of CF Industries, Tony Will. Tony has been with CF Industries since 2007. He has served in a number of executive roles, and in 2014, began his tenure serving as president and chief executive officer. Tony is a member of the Business Roundtable, a steering member of the Hydrogen Council, serves on the board of directors of the National Association of Manufacturers, and on the executive boards of the Fertilizer Institute and International Fertilizer Association. And apparently in his free time, he runs a company out of Illinois. So Tony, thank you so much for joining us today. We're talking about ways that the industrial sector can lower its carbon emissions. We're talking about comparing the relative carbon efficiency of US manufacturers against some of their competitors globally. You've recently made a commitment, which is, I will say, ambitious, to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050 and a 25% reduction in your operational emissions intensities by the year 2030. In support of those objectives, you've also committed $385 million through 2025 to decarbonize your production network and advance the production of clean hydrogen. These are, in fact, ambitious objectives, ambitious commitments. I'm just curious at the top, what led you to make these commitments?
Well, Greg, thanks for having me. It's great to be here this morning, and I listened with great attention to Senator Cassidy and Katrina's sessions, and I couldn't be more aligned with everything that I heard this morning. In terms of what we're doing at CF and why our focus is on decarbonizing, as Katrina mentioned, ammonia production is energy intensive and therefore has a fairly large greenhouse gas footprint. And because ammonia is 3 parts hydrogen, 1 part nitrogen, it's got tremendous energy density and is an ideal carrying plate and storage mechanism for hydrogen and is an energy source itself without any kind of carbon associated with it. So it really not only provides a clean energy source and a storage transport mechanism for hydrogen, but it does so in a carbon-free way. And so our focus has been on decarbonizing the production part of that process in order to really provide a zero or near zero carbon solution for clean energy. And I think that this is not only critically important from a climate perspective, but it's good business and good for the U.S. As Katrina mentioned, we already run some of the most efficient, lowest carbon intensity ammonia production globally. And the steps that we're taking now, including carbon capture and sequestration, and then putting in place some green electrolysis processes to make green hydrogen, green ammonia, are important steps along our journey. And it would be disappointing from my perspective, Greg, to only hit a 25% reduction by the time we get to 2030. I think we should be a little bit more ambitious, lean forward, and really shoot for 50%, but we're committed to at least 25%.
Well, thank you for those opening thoughts. And I want to come back to something you said just a moment ago, which is the business opportunity you see as part of hydrogen fuels and some of your low carbon products. I'm curious if you could just speak a little bit more about the opportunity you see for the business longer term in some of these lower carbon production pathways. Is this, as you mentioned, this isn't just about making an environmental projection or environmental promise, which is important, certainly, but there's a long-term business opportunity. I wonder if you could just speak a little bit more about that.
You bet. So the first 2 applications that we see using ammonia as a low carbon or zero carbon energy source is the first one is for electricity generation. So both Japan and Korea are moving very rapidly forward with initiatives around co-firing ammonia with coal to generate electricity. Obviously, in the aftermath of the tragedy at Fukushima, Japan has been scaling back their nuclear power fleet. They've had to replace that with coal. That's going the wrong way from a climate perspective. And this is an initiative that not only reduces ultimately NOx and other kinds of emissions, but dramatically reduces coal consumption and therefore greenhouse gas. And that is right in front of us. We're working with Mitsui and JERA, who's the big Japanese utility company, on providing inputs for tests. And hopefully that will be something that ramps up here to about 5 million tons a year by the end of this decade. So that's number one, which is direct usage for electricity generation. The second one is using ammonia as a zero emissions maritime fuel. So currently IMO 2030 requires a reduction in both sulfur and greenhouse gas emissions. There are some different ways to get there, but by the time you get to 2050, you really have to be running the maritime fleet on a zero carbon fuel source, and ammonia fits in very well. It's a globally traded commodity. It's already shipped in and out of over 170 seaports. And we're working with a consortium in the Port of Singapore to demonstrate the viability of using ammonia as a maritime shipping fuel. So we're really excited about both of those opportunities. They both are right in front of us. And we think as the world's largest producer of ammonia, we need to be leading and setting the stage for decarbonizing the network.
Well, and let's turn to your 2050 commitment for a moment. It's net zero emissions is where we need to be targeting, and I imagine you wouldn't have signed off on such a goal if you didn't think we could get there. But we also recognize that we have a lot of work ahead of us to decarbonize the industrial sector. What gives you a confidence that your company can get to net zero by 2050? What gives you confidence that others in the energy intensive industrial space can get there as well?
Yeah, I think the way that the U.S. is approaching this situation is actually ideal and provides a significant competitive advantage against other countries in terms of their approach. So Canada, the EU, the UK are taking much more of a stick approach, and the US is taking a carrot approach. So the 45Q tax credit that has been recently enhanced as part of the Inflation Reduction Act is a really important incentive system to allow us to make the kind of investments that we're making currently, both in terms of hydrogen production, but also carbon capture and sequestration. And our belief is that that will continue to grow. And it's an important step. Now, we do think that we need some additional policies that will help support the competitiveness of the industry while we're making these very substantial investments. So in broad terms, we have about Scope 1 emissions, a third. A third of them are coming from N2O emissions out of our nitric acid production. And we've got an identified pathway to go ahead and eliminate those. About a third of our emissions come from combustion and fuel usage to drive heat and energy for the process. And for that, we're going to need to do flue gas capture of the CO2 emissions. And that process is a fairly expensive one. So that needs to be about $150 a ton in order to be able to justify that economically. But with the right kind of incentive system and packages that can be put together, we think we can get there. Now, what I think we need to support that investment is going to be some border mechanism so that we can level the playing field and reward good behavior, early actors, and not allow carbon leakage to take place where lower cost producers are bringing in much higher carbon intensive products into the US and undercutting US manufacturing. And then the third piece is there is ongoing research and development in reducing the cost of going ahead and doing flue gas capture. So the combination, I think, of the right regulatory background and some of the technology development that's taking place should allow us to get that 1/3 that's currently going up the flue stack in the form of energy and combustion CO2. And then the last third is process CO2. So CO2 is a byproduct of the ammonia production process. Some of that gets used to create another fertilizer product called urea, and the rest of it is vented. So what we are focused on right now, and as you mentioned, the $385 million capital commitment is on conditioning the CO2 that we're capturing already as part of the process CO2, dehydrating it, compressing it, and getting ready for geological sequestration. And so we have a pathway identified for 2/3, and the last third is going to require some ongoing legislative policies as well as some technology development. But again, we feel very comfortable that by 2035, 2040, we ought to have those things in place to be able to make the necessary investments to be carbon neutral by 2050.
I want to dig in just a moment on some of the policy concepts you just discussed and explore what you think is essential for policies to achieve the objectives that you've been talking about this morning. But before we go there, first, I want to just remind folks listening in that you can ask questions through me to Tony in the chat box, and we'll get to as many as we can. But Tony, you mentioned your direct and your indirect emissions. Another piece of your strategy, which impresses me, is your decision to sort of leverage your fairly substantial supply chains, your sort of reach within the industry, the number of customers and suppliers you have to further accelerate this transition. Often this is referred to as Scope 3 emissions. So along with committing to reduce your own emissions, you've committed to helping your suppliers and customers do that as well. Can you talk a little bit more about how you plan to do that?
Yeah, you bet. Both on the sort of the upstream Scope 3 and the downstream Scope 3, we're focused on this. On the upstream side, a lot of the Scope 3 emissions tend to be fugitive methane slip or leak, and so we're focused on setting up partnerships and agreements and long-term supply contracts with those that are focused on reducing and eliminating that. On the downstream Scope 3, we are putting a lot of money in terms of investment around best management practices and on-farm application of nitrogen-based fertilizers, use of cover crops, and so forth, in order to reduce the volatilization of ammonia, the production of N2O on field, and overall reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that come from agriculture. And so those are really the two focuses we have on the Scope 3 side of things. There is more work to be done on the on-field applications, but I think we're headed in the right direction. There is some good research going on, and we're committed to continuing to fund and disseminate that information.
So let's turn now to policy. So we released a report today, which I know you've seen, which highlights that the U.S. ammonia manufacturing sector is more carbon efficient than most of the rest of the world. And I happen to know that you operate some of the most carbon efficient facilities in North America. So it's quite likely that many, if not all of your facilities enjoy an even wider carbon advantage than the world average, than many of our global competitors. We share an interest in finding ways to leverage that to reward those who are operating the most cleanly, the most carbon efficiently, as a way to lower global emissions. But we would agree there's a big role for policy in expediting this process. We've already talked a little bit about some form of a border carbon adjustment. I'm just curious, from your perspective as a energy intensive manufacturer, but also one that's operating more efficiently relative to your global competitors, what's needed for that kind of a policy to work to accomplish the goals that we've been talking about today?
Yeah, great question, and I think it's really the central part of our focus when we're meeting with policymakers, which is to drive this point home. We would like to move faster. It is a fairly capital-intensive process in order to reduce our emissions profile. And today, other than the power gen and possibly marine applications, there's not a lot of desire from the customer side to pay more for low carbon products. I think that will change over time, particularly if there's the right incentive structures in place to reward that. But right now, that means we're bearing the cost of the capital without necessarily getting any kind of reward for it in the marketplace. And so policy does play a very critical role in helping to further accelerate this. And as you mentioned, I think a carbon border adjustment is the ideal way to get there. I mean, in the long term, in an ideal situation, we would have a global cost of carbon, and those then that are lower carbon intensity would by definition benefit from it. I think that's hard to implement and hard to imagine that that's going to happen soon. So in the near term, a carbon border adjustment mechanism or measurement mechanism would be really important in order to help facilitate that same kind of dynamic. So looking at the carbon intensity of production is a quick way to get there. There are not tens of thousands of products that we're talking about. It's, for the most part, ammonia. And ammonia production is relatively easy to measure in terms of the carbon intensity. It could be implemented fairly quickly without a lot of difficulty in the measurement process. And that to level the playing field with respect to the carbon intensity of ammonia production and rewarding those companies that are making those big capital investment decisions early is one way to further the advantage that we already have in the way of U.S. production being lower carbon intensive than many other parts of the world. And so, we are very focused on trying to make sure that we've got a level playing field so that we're not incurring carbon leakage by having lower cost products that are very higher in terms of carbon intensity come in and take market share. It leads to exactly the problem that Senator Cassidy was talking about, where we're exporting production to higher carbon intensive regions, and that's bad for the economy, and it's bad for the U.S., and it's bad for the climate globally. So we'd like to start with a border measurement mechanism looking at carbon intensity.
Well, we very much agree with you. And so I wonder if you would be willing to just share a little bit more about the potential upside if we get this kind of approach correctly. We agree. The objective here is to levelize the playing field, have everybody competing in part on the basis of carbon intensity. But for those manufacturers out there, for those manufacturers in the United States who are operating more efficiently, what's the opportunity ahead of us if we get these policies right? And if we do, what kind of, or how might that impact a company executive like yourself? Perhaps, how would it impact your decision making, or how might you imagine it might impact the decision making of your peers if we had this kind of incentive structure in place?
Yeah, you bet. So Katrina's report, I think, referenced the fact that the U.S. is already about 24% more efficient from a carbon intensity perspective in ammonia production than the rest of the world. And I think that is principally predicated on just feedstock and electricity generation. I think that may understate the advantage that we have from a carbon intensity perspective, because as Katrina mentioned, we have been free market buyers of natural gas and electricity. If you go back pre-shale boom the natural gas shale boom, we were actually a fairly high cost natural gas marketplace compared to the rest of the world. And therefore we had to become very efficient. We had to debottleneck our plants. We had to invest in efficiencies. And so my expectation is when you take into consideration those changes at the firm level that's happened as opposed to the industry as a whole, we would show up as being much better than 24% less carbon intensive than the rest of the world. And I think what it would allow us to do if we have that kind of regulatory framework in place is to accelerate our investments in capital to be able to reduce emissions even that much faster. So right now, as we talked about, I would like to get to 50% reduction by 2030. We have a stated goal that is hardwired of at least 25% reduction in intensity. I think if we've got the right regulatory framework, we could get to 50 easily, and it would help us not get penalized for being an early mover and an early adopter and investing up front. And it would pave the way, I think, for the rest of the industry to act similarly and reduce their emissions as well.
Well, I am sold, so I appreciate that that thought. Let me turn now to one of our audience questions. Coming back to hydrogen, obviously this is something that you've invested in quite a bit. You've got a large capital expenditure that you've committed through 2025. I'm curious your view of the importance of hydrogen for the industrial sector as part of a global decarbonization strategy. How do you see it fitting in? How important do you think it is? How important is it for your business moving forward?
Yeah, so we're already one of the largest hydrogen producers globally. We produce about 1.6 billion kilograms of hydrogen annually. That's about 2% or so of the world's production of hydrogen. It is the front end of the process that we run to make ammonia. Now, instead of selling that hydrogen, we take 100% of that hydrogen and turn it into ammonia. But as we're looking forward in terms of the role that hydrogen plays as a clean energy source, we're evaluating and thinking about hydrogen production as an end goal, not just as a way to get to ammonia production. And I think our electrolysis project to make green hydrogen is the first step in that process. I think hydrogen is a great energy storage mechanism for renewables because, as we know, the sun's not always shining, the wind's not always blowing. So you need some kind of storage mechanism to be able to have instant availability of power. And hydrogen provides that to some extent, although it's difficult to transport long distance, it's difficult to store in bulk. And that's really where we think ammonia plays a really interesting role. Ammonia's got much higher energy density. It's easy to store, it's easy to ship, and available, when you need it, where you need it. And so as we look forward, not only in terms of electricity generation, but in other applications like marine fuels, as I talked about, I think ammonia and hydrogen play a critical role in getting away from fossil fuels and reducing our greenhouse gas footprint. And we're excited to be, I would say, at the front end of that.
Well, one of the things that we talked about with the senator, one of the things that's sort of on the plate of Congress right now is some form of a permit streamlining approach, and perhaps not directly on target with what we've been talking about in this conversation. But I'm just curious, as you look ahead to the kinds of investment we need to make sort of across the country to decarbonize, how important is it that we sort of reduce some of the hurdles it takes to get some of these bigger projects placed into the marketplace?
Yeah, one of the challenges we're having right now, actually, on the carbon sequestration front is the time lag associated with getting Class 6 wells permitted through EPA. And there has been a little bit of movement trying to get states primacy in terms of being able to issue those permits. I think to date, there's only 2 states that actually have primacy. And so that's one of those areas that is critically needed to get some streamlining of that permitting process in place and allow us to begin injecting our CO2 into permanently permitted sequestration wells. So that's one area. I think, as you point out, the other challenge right now with green hydrogen production is the grid is still not where it needs to be from the standpoint of renewables. And it's actually, a study was recently conducted that it is more carbon intensive to produce green ammonia based on how the grid is currently funded from the standpoint of energy than it is to produce ammonia in the conventional way using natural gas, because there's still so much carbon intensity in terms of the electricity being generated. So I think it's a twofold approach here, one of which is we need to have the right incentive structure to bring on vast quantities of renewable energy onto the grid so that green hydrogen, green ammonia production makes sense from an environmental standpoint. And we also need help with streamlining the permitting process so that we can begin injecting CO2 that we are capturing back into the ground and not releasing it to atmosphere.
We're running close to our time, so I think I've got space here for one more question. So I want to return to the sort of topic of the day around this carbon advantage concept, the potential use of certain trade policy to leverage that advantage. You work with a number of executives at the BRT and a number of other trade associations. Things that impact global trade are obviously of great interest to many of your peers at other companies. I'm curious what your sense is of their reaction to these kinds of market incentives to encourage carbon efficient production in the US and elsewhere. What's your sense of their sort of reaction to this kind of an approach?
Yeah, Greg, I would say I think it's somewhat mixed, and people are very much looking at their own cost structures in the short term. But I think if it's a broad-based commitment to really decarbonize the economy, then we need to have the right kind of policies in place that support and reward early action and moving forward. And I think as long as we are doing that thoughtfully and across a number of different sectors so that we don't leave certain ones behind, a carbon border adjustment mechanism will absolutely reward good behavior and make the U.S. even more competitive on a global stage as we move forward. I think the challenge is asking people to make those investments to decarbonize and yet not protecting them, given the fact that costs go up as you need to make those large capital investments. And that is a difficult place to get to, which is why I think the U.S. is in such a strong position right now, because with the right type of trade policy, we can really continue to build on the advantage that we have of being a lower carbon intensive manufacturing footprint.
Well, really appreciate that thought. And Tony, really appreciate your time today, and also appreciate your forward-looking approach to climate. We certainly hope that you meet, and we have faith that you will meet and exceed your 2030 targets, and look forward to working with some of your colleagues in DC to track that progress. So again, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thanks for having me. And again, applaud what you're doing and really appreciated everything that I heard earlier today. So thanks, Greg.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone who logged in to join us for our webinar today. We appreciate your time. And if you are interested in learning more about our work around the chemicals advantage or any of our other work at the Council, please visit us on our website at clcouncil.org. And with that, I will wish you a good day, and we'll see you soon.